I'm going to go ahead and welcome our first speaker, Dr. Chris Teutsch. He is a forage professor and extension specialist over at the University of Kentucky. And we have invited him here today to share with us some information and some tips on integrating warm season forages into your forage rotation and how to kind of best utilize those.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. I was born and raised on a livestock farm in Northeast Ohio. Following high school, I spent 4 years in the Navy before I came back to the Ohio State University, where I got a bachelor's and master's degree in agronomy, and went on to the University of Kentucky, where I got a PhD in forage management and physiology. When I was at the University of Kentucky, I worked on a project that looked at stocking rates of beef cattle on reclaimed mineland. And immediately after graduate school, I had the good fortune of getting hired at a great land grant institution, and that's Virginia Tech. And I spent 17 years at Virginia Tech at the Southern Piedmont Research Station, which is 50 miles southwest of Richmond, Virginia. And a lot of the data that you'll see today was generated there, so it's very applicable to the region that you all are in. In 2017, I had the opportunity to come back to the University of Kentucky, and currently I'm at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center located in Western Kentucky. And again, the climate here is very similar to what you all would be experiencing in that Maryland-Delaware region. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. And Amanda asked me to talk a little bit about strategies to boost summer forage production. And we're going to focus in on warm season grasses today, primarily, but I do want to talk just a little bit about a cool season grass base and kind of how those grasses fit into the system. So whenever we talk about forages and livestock, a lot of times we try to talk about pieces of the system, but we really need to think about the system as a whole, because it can't be effectively managed without a basic understanding of how the soil, the plant, and the animal components interact, in how our management decisions in terms of how we graze those pastures, and how often, how frequently, how close, interact with these components, and also the climatic conditions. No 2 years are ever the same. Sometimes we have too much rain, sometimes not enough rain, sometimes both in the same season. So we need to think about the whole system when we talk about forages and livestock. Today we're going to focus in on forage species for the Mid-Atlantic region. And there's lots of different species that are well adapted to the Mid-Atlantic region. The ones we're going to talk about today are the warm seasons, and I've highlighted some of those that we're going to visit about today, and I'll show you a little bit of data on those. So just a quick overview of cool and warm season grasses. Cool season grasses are going to have optimal growth at about a leaf temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So things like orchard grass and tall fescue, that's when they're really going to have optimum photosynthesis, is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. They tend to be more digestible and higher in crude protein than compared with our warm season grasses. In the region that we call the transition zone, so we're not really the northern United States and not really the southern United States, but that area kind of tucked in between it that includes states like Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky, they're going to tend to have a longer total growing season. Now, in contrast, our warm season grasses evolved from our cool season grasses to get around a problem during the summer months, and that problem is called photorespiration. And photorespiration makes photosynthesis inefficient in cool season grasses during the summer months. So when we get above 70 degrees Fahrenheit in that leaf blade, we tend to reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis in our cool season grasses. Our warm season grasses evolved a mechanism to get around that problem. So they don't have optimal growth until we get into the temperature range around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So right in the middle of the summertime, when it's hot and our cool season grass photosynthesis is being suppressed by high temperatures, our warm season grasses are just hitting peak photosynthesis. So they're a nice addition to a forage system. They tend to be a little bit less digestible and lower in crude protein than our cool season grasses. They're more drought tolerant, but they're not miracles, right? They need a little bit of water to be productive, but they're more efficient at using that water. They're going to produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used compared with our warm, cool season grasses during the summer months. I don't know what's happening here. Well, we'll go on here. This is just a nice graphic representation of a cool and a warm season grass. And you'll see on the left-hand side, tall fescue. This was taken in March. It's up and actively growing compared to our Bermuda grass, which is not dead, it's just dormant. It doesn't initiate growth until we get into late April or early May in your region of the country. And this is a growth curve, and it's going to be similar for Maryland and Delaware. This is from Western Kentucky. This is a tall fescue ladino clover. So this will be our forage base. And what we see is that we have a bimodal forage distribution here. And what that means is that we have two humps of forage growth. In our cool season pastures, we'll have that large hump in the spring of initial growth, and then we'll have a secondary hump in the fall. And then during the summer months, June, July, August, and part of September, not much going on in our cool season pastures, even when we have adequate rainfall, because we are temperature limited in growth. And that's kind of where our summer grasses, whether it's an annual or a perennial, can really come into a forage system and fill that gap in. And when we're in the transition zone, we have a lot of different options that we can use for our summer grasses. Now, before we get started, I do want to take just a minute and talk about the most important cool season grass in the transition zone, and that's going to be tall fescue. This is our best adapted cool season grass, and often we view it as a curse, but I think we need to think about it as a blessing and ask ourselves, how does it fit into grazing systems? It really needs to be the base of most grazing systems in the transition zone. And how do we do that? Well, we focus on management. So we want to optimize things like soil fertility. We want to manage that stand for legumes, so we have red and white clover in our pastures. When it makes sense, we may want to incorporate a novel endophyte that doesn't have the toxins associated with Kentucky 31. And then we might want to incorporate warm season grasses into our system so that we have some place to go during the summer months with our animals when our tall fescue pastures are not actively growing. Probably the strongest attribute of tall fescue and grazing systems in the transition zone is stockpiling for winter grazing. This is actually some stockpiled forage. This was near Blackstone, Virginia. It was in mid-February. And as you can see from this photograph, even under the snow, this stockpiled forage is still 16% crude protein and 60% TDN as we get into mid-February. So this is a pretty amazing grass in terms of its ability to extend our grazing season in the transition zone of the United States. All right, let's talk about some warm season species now. Our first warm season species that I want to talk about is Annual Lespedeza. This is kind of a forgotten legume. It's a warm season annual legume. It's non-bloating. It's tolerant to lower fertility and lower pH. 60 or 70 years ago, this was a very common legume used in pasture and hay systems when we didn't have access to things like lime and fertilizer. Now, with increased access to lime and fertilizer, a lot of our improved legumes like red clover and white clover and ladino clover have replaced Annual Lespedeza in systems. There's two types. There's a Kobe and a Korean. Generally speaking, the Korean is going to be more productive in terms of yields in systems. And this is just some data that we produced at the Southern Piedmont Center when I was at Virginia Tech. We took a look at some different varieties of annual Lespedeza, and believe it or not, it's hard to get the different varieties. Marion's very hard to get. That was a variety developed at the University of Missouri. Probably the widest available named variety would be Legend, and it's a pretty good variety, but really no better in terms of yield than our Korean variety not stated varieties, and that's what these are. These are Korean from southern states. This was from a company called Evergreen Seed and another seed company, and these were all variety not stated. So generally, when people want to try annual Lespedeza, I just steer them towards a Korean variety not stated variety. I don't think there's a big advantage of Legend or Marion in grazing systems. So where does it kind of fit? Where annual Lespedeza fits is frost seeding into a pasture, and I would mix it with some red clover and maybe a little bit of ladino clover. You usually put annual Lespedeza on a rate of 10 to 15 pounds per acre, 4 to 6 pounds of red clover, 1 to 2 pounds of ladino clover. Broadcast it onto a pasture in February and let the heaving of the soil, the frost, and thawing of the soil incorporated into the soil surface. The best fit would be in pastures that are lower in fertility, so maybe rented land where you can't afford to make that investment in lime and fertilizer. The other legume that I wanted to mention that's kind of a red-headed stepchild is Sericea lespedeza. And Sericea lespedeza is our only well-adapted, long-lived, perennial, warm-season, non-bloating legume. It's well adapted to our region, often associated with an invasive species. There's an increased interest in Sericea lespedeza because it has some anti-parasitic properties for small ruminants. It's extremely drought tolerant. It's tolerant of low fertility. As far as cultivars go, there's a number of cultivars out there, but they're almost impossible to get. The only one that we can really get is one called AU Grazer, and that's a named cultivar that's been selected for kind of a mid-range in tannins, finer stems, and grazing tolerant. It needs to be, for Sericea lespedeza to really be productive, it needs to be rotationally stocked. It's got poor seedling vigor, so it is slow to establish. Just wanted to show you a little bit of data from a study that we did. This was some land that came directly out of forest production in the south side of Virginia. And what we did was we either limed strips and fertilized strips according to soil tests at seeding, or we did not. And where we limed and fertilized according to soil tests, the productivity was much higher of Sericea lespedeza. The reason I'm showing you this is we always talk about its ability to grow in poor fertility conditions, but it's much more productive when we do adjust fertility and maintain fertility at a reasonable level. And that's kind of what this data is showing. So this was where we had no fertilizer or lime at seeding, and this was the first 5 years after that. And then this is where we had lime and fertilizer. This is 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16, and then this last bar is the average. What I want you to notice is that first production year, we had almost no productivity from that Sericea lespedeza versus 2.5 tons where we applied lime and fertilizer at seeding. I think one time I calculated that and was over 30 times increase in productivity where we added fertilizer and lime at seeding with Sericea lespedeza. So it's important to remember that it does respond to some lime and fertilizer. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Bermuda grass, and I often call it the Timothy of the South. You know, Timothy's a great forage for hay production, but a lot of times it's not as well adapted in transition zone as we would like. Bermuda grass is very well adapted in the transition zone. We don't have as much planted as you would imagine, and I think it goes back to the history of Bermuda grass. Initially, it had to be vegetatively propagated, and what that means is that we had to dig those plants up, take them to another field, and then incorporate those plants into the soil. So we're moving pieces of living plant material that we call sprigs. And as we got into the transition zone, we never really had the right equipment or infrastructure or sprig sources to do that. It's not like you can dig a load of sprigs up and then let it sit around for 2 weeks. If you dig it up, I mean, it's got to get planted the next day because they'll heat and reduce their viability. So one of the things that happened when I was in Virginia was the development of seeded Bermuda grass varieties that had improved cold tolerance. And that's a pretty exciting development because we can establish these like any small seeded forage. And seeded Bermuda grass is marketed 2 ways: as a cultivar, and that's one single pure variety in a bag, or as a blend, and that could be a mixture of a couple different varieties or a mixture of Arizona Common and Giant. And those blends are okay. You want to try to avoid using blends that have Arizona Common or Giant Bermuda grass because they simply don't have the cold tolerance to survive in the transition zone. So when you choose a blend, you want to look at the seed tag and see what varieties are in that blend and make sure they're varieties that have some known cold tolerance for the transition zone. One of the tricky things about these blends is that they are given a trade name or branded is what the seed industry calls it, and that trade name stays the same every year. But what's in that bag can be completely different. So one year, Ranchero Frio could be varieties A and B. The next year, it could be varieties C and D. So just make sure that you look at the seed tag and that you know what varieties are in that particular mixture. So this is some data from the Southern Piedmont Center, so that's not too far from you all. And this looks at a 6-year average of seeded Bermuda grass production from 2002 to 2008. And what I want to look at is this long-term average. And under good management, and when I say good management, that means good soil fertility, cut every 30 days during the summer months. So we will get anywhere between 4 and 5 cuttings usually during the summer months. We yield between 6 and 7.5 tons of dry matter. So it can be highly productive, but fertility's got to be good, and you've got to replace the phosphorus and the potassium that you're removing with that hay if you're in the hay type of system. Commonly, when I see problems with Bermuda grass stands, it's because of low potash, because we're just not putting enough potash back for what we're removing from that field. So it can also be very productive in grazing situations too. So I threw this slide in because this was kind of an interesting study that I did. And one of my sidelines when I was in Virginia was when I went to a farm visit. I saw a Bermuda grass ecotype, I called it, on that farm that looked interesting. I would collect a few sprigs of it and take it back to the research station and plant it and put it in some plots and see how it did under improved management. What I found was there's tremendous variation in what we call ecotypes of Bermuda grass. Some were extremely productive under improved management, and some kind of were not productive. So the reason I'm showing you this is the ones highlighted in yellow are some of the more productive ecotypes that I selected over the years in Virginia. And the reason I'm showing you this is that they're not quite as good as the sprig types. They're probably about the same as the seeded types, some of these more productive ecotypes. And what I want you to take away from the slide is that if you already have some Bermuda grass on your farm, you might just try to improve management, and you may find that it meets your summer forage needs. One of the things I want to you to take away from the Bermuda grass discussion here today is that it's not a free lunch. For Bermuda grass to be productive, like other warm season grasses, we really need to have good nitrogen fertility. And this is kind of what this is showing, the nitrogen response of seeded Bermuda grass. And as we increase nitrogen rate, we increase productivity. So we would never want to apply 500 pounds of nitrogen to seeded Bermuda grass, but we want to be back down here on this straight part of the curve, you know, that 200 or 250 pound range. The point is that if you're not committed to applying nitrogen, Bermuda grass probably is not the summer grass for you. This is just looking at average forage quality over that 6-year period. And with good nitrogen fertility, we had good crude protein in these grasses, 14 to 15%, averaged over this long period. And that's averaged over through that 4 to 6 cuttings per year. Total digestible nutrients were very good also. The point is that with Bermuda grass, we've got to stay on top of fertility management to get good forage quality, and we've got to stay on top of cutting management. So these plots were cut every 30 days. The next species I want to talk about is commonly considered a weed, but has pretty great forage value. It's well adapted to the Mid-Atlantic region. If it wasn't for Bermuda grass and crabgrass volunteering in pastures in the south side of Virginia, we'd have a lot of hungry cows during the summer months. So crabgrass is truly a warm season annual, but it acts like a perennial through prolific reseeding. And that means that it produces a lot of seed, and that seed shatters out onto the ground, and then the seed germinates that next year, and that plant comes back from that. And there's some things that we can do to enhance that self-reseeding. One, we need to let it go to seed at least one time per growing season. And then if we do a little bit of very light tillage or dragging that pasture just to get that seed in contact with the soil, that will tend to enhance self-reseeding in that volunteer stand coming back. The nice thing about crabgrass as a summer annual is that if you make that investment in the seed one time, then and manage for self-reseeding, then you don't have to reseed it every year. Really, this needs to be double cropped with some type of winter annual. It could be a small grain like wheat or barley or rye, or annual ryegrass, or a mixture of those. But somehow it's not going to be productive from about late September until, say, May of the following year. It has good yield potential, not as good as Bermuda grass, but where it beats Bermuda grass is forage quality. No prussic acid like a sorghum sudan or a sudan grass can accumulate nitrates under very high rates of nitrogen fertilization. This is actually a Red River crabgrass stand. This is one of the first studies I did in Virginia, and this was a nitrogen trial. And those are 30-inch flags there, and the crabgrass I would expect would be about 2 feet tall 60 days after seeding. So we had really good growing conditions, good germination on the seed, and good productivity of that crabgrass stand. That happens to be Red River crabgrass. Since this time, there's been the development of about 6 commercially available varieties of crabgrass. And we actually have a crabgrass variety trial here at the University of Kentucky if you're interested in the productivity of different types of crabgrass. This is the nitrogen response of crabgrass, and as you can see, again, like Bermuda grass, it responds to nitrogen fertilization. Not as much as Bermuda grass, but we had our maximum yield at 305 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on crabgrass. We want to be back down here on the straight part of the curve, somewhere in that 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen applied to split applications to the crabgrass. Again, crabgrass really excels in terms of forage quality. We measured in vitro digestibility. That's when we take that forage material and we put it in rumen fluid from the animal of 75 to 90%. Crude protein ranged from 6 to 14%. So 6% at the end of the growing season when that plant was senescing. In season, we were really looking, depending on nitrogen fertilization, between 10 and 14%. Dalrymple, who's kind of the crabgrass guru, summarized a bunch of stalker studies that used crabgrass as the forage base at the Noble Foundation. And what he found was that on medium quality crabgrass, he averaged about 1.8 pounds a day, average daily gain on stalkers over a long period of time. When Bermuda grass and crabgrass went head-to-head in another study in Oklahoma, they found that Bermuda grass yielded about 1 pound of average daily gain, versus crabgrass, which came in at about £1.75 pounds. So I'd like to talk about the next species, and I may get thrown off the conference call for talking about this, but this is another naturally occurring forage plant that we have in pastures, and that's Johnson grass, or as I like to call it, Perennial Sudex. Don't tell anyone that I told you to plant this, because I'm not telling you to plant it, but it does naturally occur on many farms, and it could be a summer forage resource. It's in the sorghum species. It spreads by seeds and rhizomes, commonly found on old dairy farms and in bottomland. It thrives under hay management, so it likes to be defoliated and then rested. And we commonly see it in hay fields. Not found in continuously stocked pastures, and the reason why is that animals tend to graze it because it's palatable during the summer months, and that repeated defoliation grazes it out of the pasture. We will see it tend to increase in rotationally stocked pastures because it likes that defoliation and then rest period following defoliation. Response to nitrogen fertilization has a good quality if well managed, and that means harvesting at the boot stage or less, so not letting it get too mature. And does have prussic acid, so we need to be very careful of grazing pastures around first frost that have Johnson grass in them. Can accumulate nitrates like other summer annual grasses under drought conditions and high nitrogen fertilization. This is just kind of an interesting table. This was from the Noble Foundation. It looked at the nutritive value of different perennial warm season grasses. And interestingly enough, at the top of the nutrition list was Bermuda grass and Johnson grass. So two things that we often consider weeds were actually pretty productive when managed and pretty nutritious. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some improved summer annual forages. And these would include sorghum species like sorghum Sudan grass, and pearl millet. This was some data from 2009. We had been testing summer annual species at the research station in Blackstone, Virginia since the early 2000s. But in 2009 was the first year that we looked at digestibility of these species. And we had 20-some varieties in the test that year. And if I put all those in the table, the lettering's so small that nobody can see them. So what I've done is chose a couple that were our top performers, a couple that were our bottom performers, and a couple that were kind of in the middle. And we had a forage sorghum in here, we had a sorghum Sudan grass, we had a Sudan grass, and we had pearl millets. Some of them had what we call the BMR trait, or the brown midrib trait. That's a phenotypic expression of something that's different inside that plant, and it's associated with lower levels of lignin. And lignin is a compound that makes plant fiber less digestible. So when we have the BMR trait, we tend to have plant fiber that tends to be more digestible. And then we looked at the yield at this first harvest, and then the in vitro true digestibility. Remember that's that digestibility when we take that forage material, put it in room and fluid from the animal, and measure what those microbes are able to digest. So what was interesting when we got this data back from the lab was that we had a huge range in vitro digestibility, 54 to 74%. And when I saw that, I said, well, certainly it's going to be related to yield. So the varieties that were lower yielding, were less mature, are going to have higher digestibility. And when we started to match that data up, what we found, lo and behold, was that some of the varieties that had the highest yields also had very high levels of in vitro digestibility. And that kind of got me interested in this relationship between yield and digestibility. So we started to look at this over multiple years. This was the nice example of the BMR trait. And you can see the actual midrib of this leaf is a brown or tannish color, indicating that trait, or there's something different inside that leaf, and that tends to be lower levels of lignin. So when we looked at the BMR trait, and this was over a multi-year period, and these were averaged over all the varieties that had the BMR trait, which was the black bar in the trial, and did not have the BMR trait, which was the gray bar within each year. The letters indicate differences within a year. So when the letters are different, that means that the difference in digestibility was significant. So what we can see is a very consistent trend in varieties that had the BMR trait were more digestible than varieties that did not have the BMR trait. It's not a perfect relationship. Sometimes that digestibility difference, which is on average 3 to 5%, would be 10% for a given variety. And sometimes it would be hardly different than a conventional variety. So there is, even within the BMR varieties that have the BMR trait, some variation. But as a whole, varieties that have the BMR trait tend to be more digestible and lower in lignin than varieties that do not. Anyways, over this long period, we generated all this data. I mean, thousands and thousands of data points, and we put them in spreadsheets, and we showed people the spreadsheets, and people would look at the spreadsheets and say, oh, that's nice. And then their eyes will kind of glaze over, and that's the last they would ever look at them. So one of our goals was to try to figure out how to get this data in a way that people could actually visualize it. And we kind of came up with this graph. What we did was we looked at the yield and the digestibility, and the yield here on the x-axis, and it was indexed against the average for the trial. So 0 on this graph would be the average yield for the varieties in that trial. And then we could rank all the other varieties as being above average in yield or below average in yield. We did the exact same thing for the in vitro true digestibility diff. And this was the average digestibility here on the y-axis. And then we ranked the varieties either being above average in digestibility or below average. And what this allowed us to do was break these this graph up into 4 quadrants. We have varieties on our lower left-hand corner that had below average yield and below average digestibility. Those are varieties that you probably want to avoid when you're selecting varieties for your forage program. What you really want to look at is these varieties up here in this right top quadrant. These are varieties that had above average yield and above average digestibility. Those are varieties that you may want to consider putting into a forage program. And we took all this data in whenever we had a variety that had above average yield and digestibility, we put it in a table and we put an X in the box for that year. And what we really want to start to look for is varieties that had consistent performance. Just like any other variety trial, we want to look for varieties that had above average yield and above average digestibility for more than 1 year. And sometimes we could find for 3 or 4 years, we would have varieties that had above average yield and digestibility. Those are really varieties that you want to think about putting into a forage program. So I just want to mention a couple places where summer annuals might fit into forage systems in the Mid-Atlantic region. What I don't think you should do is go out and plant all your pastures into annual forages. That doesn't make any sense for where we're at in the country. What we really want to think about is how do we use these annuals within a perennial forage system. So one place may be a weaning system for fall-born calves. So if we have shifted our calving season to the fall to avoid problems with rebreeding and toll fescue toxicosis, which we commonly do in the transition zone, our calves are born in November, and then we would wean them in June. And a lot of times we'll background those calves and get them on feed before we sell them to add value to those calves. Those kind of programs cost about $2.25 a day. And summer annuals may provide a very cost-effective backgrounding system for those calves versus a confinement type system with hay and a commercial supplement. The second place that they may fit, and I think this is probably the best fit, is using summer annuals as part of a renovation system. So we would have a pasture renovation cycle that we would have on the farm. I think there's a lot of missed opportunities in terms of improved forage genetics that we just don't get into pastures because we're not renovating pastures on a regular basis. And probably the biggest one is the novel endophyte technology. We have a number of different novel endophyte cultivars of tall fescue now. And what we know is that the difference in animal performance is real compared to Kentucky 31. If we've got really toxic pastures in Kentucky 31, we're going to see significant increase when we move from Kentucky 31 to a novel endophyte tall fescue. So a renovation cycle will kind of work like this. We'd identify a weak pasture that's in need of renovation. We could come in the fall, we spray a non-selective herbicide, and then we no-till in some type of winter annual or winter annual mix. It could be a ryegrass or a small grain or a mixture of small grain and brassicas, but some type of winter annual mix. We graze or harvest those winter annuals that following winter and spring. And then we come in and we plant a summer annual or summer annual mixture in that pasture. And we can graze or harvest that summer annual. And then we come in, we spray with Roundup again, and we establish our perennial forage sod in late summer or early fall. This is a nice cycle because it allows you to produce forage during that renovation cycle. And that's kind of important when we were renovating pastures. And then we can move to the next pasture. So what we have is kind of a continuous renovation going on the farm. We're identifying weak pastures and then we're renovating those weak pastures instead of waiting for all the pastures on the farm to become weakened. All right, I want to kind of circle back to tall fescue, which is our best adapted cool season grass, and kind of finish things up by talking about an alternative strategy to filling in that summer slump in cool season forage production, and that would be stockpiling cool season grasses in the spring and utilizing them during the summer months. And we had a significant amount of work going on in Virginia about that, and it was conducted by David Fisk. He did a long-term demonstration at the Shenandoah Valley AREC, and then John Benner and Matt Boer are extension agents that worked closely with David on this demonstration project. And then I also did some work at the Southern Piedmont Center looking at some summer stockpiling studies with and without animals. All right, so I'll just give you a brief overview of this presentation, and I don't have time to give you the whole presentation today. So we talk about tall fescue in the transition zone, and then I go into detail about Virginia Tech summer stockpiling demonstration at the Shenandoah Valley AREC, which I'm not going to do today. We look at some data on the impact of the novel endophyte on the ability to be stockpiled, and then look at some animal performance on novel endophyte tall fescue that had during the summer months where those animals were grazed in August. So just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit, this is again our traditional cool season grass growth curve for a tall fescue pasture with some ladino clover in it. And we've got our bimodal forage distribution. So 2 humps here in the spring and then again in the fall when things start to cool down, not much going on in the summertime. So in traditional stockpiling systems, we accumulate the second hump of growth, and then we use that growth to graze as we move into the winter months. Still very effective way to reduce the amount of hay that we need to feed in this system. And if you're not stockpiling in late summer, I would highly encourage you to think about doing that. So the summer stockpiling is kind of thinking about this a little bit differently. So we've got kind of a set stocking rate. Most of us are not going to buy and sell animals to adjust our stocking rate on our farm. And the idea is we take this hump that we would normally harvest mechanically or just clip with a bush hog, and we kind of move it in and save it for the summer months to fill that gap in. So this is a little bit different way to manage something that we already might have on our farms. So I don't have time to go through all the details today, but I do want to point you towards our YouTube channel. We've got a really good presentation on there. It's called Summer Stockpiling, Thinking Outside the Box. And you can watch that at your leisure. And it talks about the demonstration that was conducted and the research that was conducted in Virginia on summer stockpiling. And there's hundreds of other videos on our YouTube channel also. So it's a great resource if you're not familiar with that particular YouTube channel. And to get to it, just search KY Forages YouTube. It'll be the first or second thing that pops up. The other resource that I wanted to point you towards was our University of Kentucky Forages webpage. I think it's one of the best forages web pages in the United States. And to get to it, just search Kentucky Forages and it'll bring you right to that webpage. And just to point out here on the webpage, we have something called the Forage News. This comes out every month. It's a series of short articles that are timely. And you can subscribe to this newsletter and get a PDF version by clicking here and just putting your email in. All right, I'm finished, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came in the chat, so I'm going to go through those now. Okay, so we had a question that said, when you suggest cutting every 30 days, is that more for on the hay production side or on the mowing for pasture maintenance?
So the data that we showed was under hay type management, and we would recommend cutting for hay every 30 days. So that particular study was managed under hay type management. When we graze a Bermuda grass pasture, we really want to start grazing at about 4 inches. So and that's quite different than a cool season pasture. Bermuda grass growth tends to be condensed, the sward, and it's very dense towards the soil surface. In order to keep it palatable and keep the nutrient value up, you want to graze it when it's about 4 inches tall, and then graze it down to 1 to 2 inches. So we take about half of what's there. And that'll be a little bit different than we're used to with, say, something like orchard grass or tall fescue, where we wouldn't want to graze closer than 4 to 5 inches.
Great, thank you. The next question is, recently there has been concern about how fertilizer reduces root mass because the plants do not have to grow further to reach the nutrients, reducing their resilience. Can you talk about this or expand on this at all?
Well, I'm not familiar with that research, but I will say that for pastures to be productive, we need a base level of soil fertility, and so we shouldn't over fertilize for sure, because it has it's negative both economically and environmentally. But we want to maintain our soil fertility levels in terms of phosphorus and potassium in that medium plus to high minus range. That's going to give us optimal pasture productivity. That means we're not limiting yield by those nutrients. And then we want to maintain our pH at a range of around 6 to 6.4, and a little bit higher if we're growing we want alfalfa on our pastures. And if we can avoid putting nitrogen on by incorporating legumes in our pastures, that's a win-win for us, because we're bringing nitrogen into that system through dinitrogen fixation of that legume plant. That nitrogen is being shared mostly indirectly through the animal with the grass plants through nutrient cycling. And we're improving forage quality in that pasture, and we're diluting the toxic endophyte and tall fescue pastures. So legumes are an important part of grassland ecosystems.
Great. The next question is, will you mention the best method or timing, or method and timing, for establishing Sericea? Is there any luck with frost seeding it?
So the answer is probably no for frost seeding, because the seedlings are so lack vigor. So the best method for Sericea would be seeding it alone, and then incorporating grass into the stand once you get the seedlings up and established. It's just going to be very hard to incorporate into a well-established sod because the seedling vigor is so poor. Usually where you see Sericea really thrive at is under conditions where other forage species are less competitive.
Great, thank you. The next question is, if you're just interested in yield, what would yield more for horse quality hay? Something like a novel endophyte free fescue or something like an orchard grass?
Probably fescue would have more long-term yield than orchard grass, although orchard grass will probably be more desirable in the horse hay market. Although there's absolutely nothing wrong with the novel endophyte fescue that's cut at the proper stage of growth for horse hay. I will mention one thing that's not related to the talk today, but probably one of the worst things that have happened to orchard grass stands is the increased use of disc mowers, because we can mow stands so closely, and orchard grass just will not tolerate that close and frequent defoliation with a disc mower. So if you're using a disc mower to harvest orchard grass, make sure that it's tilted up so that you're leaving as much possible residue. And the ideal situation would be to put a shoe package on it so that you're not cutting closer than about 4 inches.
Yep, I would agree with that. Okay, the last question that I'm seeing in the chat is there a recommended herbicide to eradicate established Bermuda grass without destroying other desirable grasses?
I don't know. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm not a herbicide guy, and you're going to hear, I think, today from a herbicide guy. So yeah, that would be a much more appropriate question for him.
Yeah, so we can revisit that question when we have Dr. Van Gessel. He's the weed specialist.
I will say one thing about Bermuda grass. So earlier this year, I gave a presentation for the Forage and Grassland Council conference here in Kentucky, and it talked about shifting botanical composition of pastures, so what plant species are dominant within pastures with management. And when we have mixtures of things like Bermuda grass and tall growing grass and pastures, so one thing Bermuda grass does not withstand well is shading. So if we have a mixture of, say, tall fescue and Bermuda grass in a pasture, if we increase our defoliation height in that pasture, so we're not grazing it down to 1 to 2 inches, we're going to tend to shift that composition towards the taller growing cool season grass in the transition zone. And the opposite happens if we decrease our grazing height and increase our grazing frequency. We'll tend to shift that mixture towards the Bermuda grass side.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions I'm seeing right now. If I missed anybody's question, or if you think of another question that you have, feel free to pop that into the chat, or you can raise your hand or something, and you can have someone speak their question as well. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have time for discussion and questions if there are any. Otherwise, if not, we'll probably proceed with our next speaker.